My name is Bond, James Bond. I thought that was kind of corny, but I had to do it. How many of you saw the movie? Well, what you're going to learn here today and what you learned in that is completely different. Any similarity is purely coincidental. I want to thank all of you for coming to the Richard Nixon Foundation's School Editors Forum. We've had several of these before. We've had distinguished people, as we do today, at every one of them, including the former UN Ambassador, Madeleine Albright, who said that the questions that you students asked were more intelligent than the ones asked by the United Nations Press Corps. So you got something to live up to there. We do this because we want to give you an opportunity to kind of experience what is done daily, several times daily, at the White House. It's a White House press briefing. So pretend like I'm the press secretary or a White House staff official, and we're interested in briefing you as the Washington Press Corps on what the CIA is doing. Because you've been saying, well, these guys do, and you want to know about them. So I'm going to introduce them, and they're going to tell you a little bit about what you do, what they do, and then we'll open it up to questions. So be thinking all along of your questions. If you write stories and take pictures of today's experience and send them to us, we'll post them on our web and make a big deal out of it. So that'll enhance your resume, perhaps. The thing I hope you absorb from this is not only what the Central Intelligence Agency, the most respected and capable information gathering organization in the history of our planet that our world has ever known, and all of its objectives are good and positive. And your image of it is probably a little bit of Hollywood, which of course is designed to sell tickets. Their program is, the CIA's agency's mission is far different from selling theater tickets, so they aren't quite as dramatic in their public presentation. But I want you also to be thinking about why young people should work for the CIA, and they are active recruiters of young people. Because in today's world, technology is so important to the process of information gathering and analysis that it's perhaps to a great degree a young person's field. So be thinking about that. And if you write stories, I hope if you're impressed with what you see in here today, you'll perhaps encourage people to apply. We have two distinguished CIA officials with us. Charlie Allen has spent his career in intelligence, in the intelligence community, more than 40 years with the CIA. He's Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Collection and revolutionizing the way the various national intelligence agencies coordinate and target their activities. He chaired the National Intelligence Collection Board, which united all intelligence agencies under common collection strategies. He also served as director of the National Warning Staff, the National Intelligence Officer for Counterterrorism, Deputy Chief for Intelligence of the CIA's Counterintelligence Center. I'd love a title like that. You know, I got this thing of President of the Richard Nixon Foundation, which impresses my friends, but wouldn't you love to be the Deputy Chief for Intelligence of CIA Counterterrorism Center? That's hot. During his tenure at the Department of Homeland Security, he served as Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis and Assistant Secretary for Information Analysis and Chief of Intelligence. Now I'm going to ask him to speak for a few minutes, and then I will come back and introduce Andy Lippmann. Mr. Allen.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Nixon Library, and it's a great pleasure to see so many young people here who want to learn about the Central Intelligence Agency, about intelligence. What is it? What isn't it? We're not James Bonds, but we certainly do some very astonishing things in a lot of ways. I spent 47 years at CIA. I then finished my government career as 3 years working for Secretary Michael Chertoff, who was Secretary of Homeland Security. I was his Chief Intelligence Officer and did intelligence and analysis. But why do people come to the Central Intelligence Agency? I think they become, at least I came, because of the mission. I came to CIA in 1958 in the Cold War. And there was almost an inexorable march of communism. Western Europe had been under threat. We saw communism in Southeast Asia, and there had to be a response. The response had long been underway by the time I joined the Central Intelligence Agency, because a man named Bill Colby ran covert action programs in France and in Italy against the communists. And how did he do this? He ran it against the communists through the Christian Democratic parties. He used the CDUs. He used, in those days, instead of iPhones and text messages, we had duplicating machines. And so we sent a lot of information out. And first, in 1949, the communists were defeated in Italy, and in 1950, they were defeated in France. And, you know, I worked directly for Bill Colby for a period of time when I was on the President's Daily Brief. He's an amazing individual, and we'll talk in my talk tomorrow on the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, I'll talk a little bit more about Bill Colby and my admiration for him. I've done a lot of things in those 47 years at CIA. I started working as simply a leadership analyst, and then I moved on to work on Africa. Spent time as an analyst on West Africa, then ran Southern African analysis. I was chosen to go to the War College. I spent a year at the Air War College, did graduate studies at Auburn University to further develop me, because the agency does that. It wants to develop the people. But I thought the mission was the most important thing. We were answering the most perplexing problems facing a president, whether it's President Nixon, President Clinton, President today, President Obama. We handle the most serious issues relating to national security. And national security changed on 9/11. 9/11 was a devastating attack upon the United States and its interests. We had a bright line between foreign and domestic activities. Domestic activities were more investigative and fell under the Federal Bureau of Investigation. CIA and other intelligence agencies worked on foreign intelligence collection. That was a fatal weakness which we saw our enemies, Al-Qaeda, exploit very seriously. But during the years, I've done a lot of things. As was indicated, I worked in counterterrorism. I served Bill Casey as the National Intelligence Officer for Counterterrorism for about 3.5 years. I was the National Intelligence Officer for Warning for 4 years, which I took very seriously. Bob Gates was the director for a while, and then I worked for Judge Webster in that capacity. I also was at one time, thanks to Bill Casey, not only the NIO for counterterrorism, but the NIO for counter-narcotics, which was something we found ourselves involved in. I was seconded by Bill Casey for 3 years to the Pentagon, where I worked on a highly compartmented program under President Reagan, Ronald Reagan. The program was a White House-directed program. I can't talk about it. It's still compartmented. It's still very sensitive. Much of the information has never been released involving that program, but it was in the Cold War, and it was in times of risk in the Cold War in the 1980s when there was instability in the Soviet leadership. It was a program designed to strengthen U.S. national security. And I'm very proud of those years where I did acquisition working out of the Department of Defense. I came back to CIA and had the pleasure of working for Bill Casey on counterterrorism, then working on narcotics, later on warning. For 7 years, I served at CIA as George Tenet's at his right hand or left hand, dealing with collection. I was Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Collection. My job was not only to press my own agency on collection, which is focused not only on clandestine operations, but also technical collection, but to force the rest of the intelligence community to work as a team, to work against targets identified by the President and by his National Security Council, and whether it's President Clinton, whether it's President George W. Bush, whether it's President Obama. We have national intelligence requirements, some of which are very high in what we call a Tier 1 requirement, which means it's the highest requirement possible. So it's those kinds of activities that inspired me. And when we had great success, and the great success occurred when we were inside the deepest secrets of our enemies, and we had many ways of doing this, obviously through recruiting agents, sometimes through technical collection that was phenomenal and remains phenomenal. The Central Intelligence Agency remains a global organization. It has very gifted people. It needs new people as well. It needs people like you. Nothing could be a greater to me, given my history, greater job satisfaction, the Hertzberg theory of job satisfaction, than working for the Central Intelligence Agency as an analyst, as a technologist, as a support or logistics individual, or as a clandestine operator, which of course we heard in the theme song of James Bond, Clandestine Operations. I work for some very great people that you've never heard of. I'll mention some of them in my remarks tomorrow. But these are people that were true giants when I walked in, people, some of whom came out of the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor organization of the CIA, and some of them are people who joined the CIA before I did, people that I admired, and they were great role models to me. We worked very hard. This is extremely hard work at the CIA. We don't work normal 9-to-5 jobs. We work incredibly long hours, and sometimes it's always 7 days a week. But it's the mission and the job satisfaction that counts. I'll turn it over to introduction of Andy.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks very much. Our other speaker is Andy Lippmann, and he is the former Principal Deputy Director at the National Counterterrorism Center, previously Deputy Director for Intelligence at the Center. He's had an incredibly distinguished career in the intelligence community. He served as Deputy Director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center, running one of the CIA's highest priority, most complex and largest units. He handled much of the policy coordination and congressional interaction and interagency relationships. He led the agency's Office of Iraq Analysis for 2 years and held a series of other high-level positions in the Directorate of Intelligence. His assignments outside of the CIA, including time at the Department of State, the Non-Proliferation Center, and the National Intelligence Council. So, ladies and gentlemen, Andy Lippmann.
Thanks, Andy. Charlie and I were actually talking as we were walking in about how we are a study in contrasts in many ways, and I'll tell you a very different story about how you can end up at CIA. I'm a California native. I grew up in Northern California, went to school for a couple of years in San Diego, but I graduated from Cal. And my major in college was forestry. So, you know, After college, I went up, worked in the redwoods for a couple of years, marking timber and cruising timber and doing what lumberjacks do. Pretty happy about it. Not a very good career choice, not very lucrative, not very safe. I was about to get married. My wife said, I want to go back and work for the government. And, forestry is fun, but it's really not a career. And I agreed. So we got married and hopped in my pickup truck and drove back east. And I got a job as a waiter, and my wife was working for the Defense Department. And and there's a sort of definite theme in my career. It involves my wife actually telling me what to do. And I came home from being a waiter one day and said, the tips were terrible today, and it's, really horrible work. And she said, well, you need to find a real job. You're 23, and it's time to grow up. So I applied for the agency, not really knowing what it was. It sounded interesting and fun and sort of an adventure. And plus, I had taken imagery classes in college, which actually qualified me to do something. And I got hired as an imagery analyst and started in 1982. And, they asked me when I was doing an interview for the agency, what do you want to be doing in 10 years? And the one thing about CIA, and if any of you ever apply for a job there or work there, there's lots of reasons why people do well. There's one central trait that I think is necessary, and that's honesty. And when they asked me what I wanted to do in 10 years, I was 23, and I didn't really know, but I said I'd really like to be back in the redwood forests of Northern California. And they hired me anyway. So this was under President Reagan. They were hiring a lot of people. Now, how many of you are in the top 5% of your high school class in terms of grades? That's good. I was not, nor in college. And, I learned a lot on the job. I became almost immediately a Middle Eastern analyst, probably because, I'd been a forestry major and there's so many trees in the Middle East. I don't know. And I immediately discovered that being an analyst at CIA is all about telling stories and condensing a vast amount of information into something really short and to the point, and something that a senior person could read. And that really, I think, gave me an advantage in my career. I thought I'd outline 3 or 4 things I did that when I was wandering the forests in Northern California and someone had said, you know what, in 25 years you're going to be doing this, I would have laughed out loud. So most recently, I ended up as the deputy in the National Counterterrorism Center. And the National Counterterrorism Center is the place that was established after 9/11 to make sure that all government agencies were talking to each other. And sadly, before 9/11, they weren't. As Charlie said, we had the domestic infrastructure, we had a foreign infrastructure. They got along okay, but they really didn't share much information. And after 9/11, we discovered the CIA had some data and the FBI had some data, and if we'd mixed them, maybe we would have been able to find a couple of these guys. So I was the number 2 in charge of that. And one of my jobs, particularly when the director was out, was to brief the president every 2 weeks. We would go to the president and say, Mr. President, in 8 minutes or less, here's what's happening out in the world of terrorism. And I'd interacted with presidents before. I'd actually had the honor of briefing the first President Bush, President Clinton, the second President Bush, and now was my chance to meet President Obama. And it was a pretty heady experience. The president was at one end of the table, I'm at the other end, and in between us are all of the cabinet secretaries. It was General Petraeus, still at CIA, Janet Napolitano, and I'm speaking. The president is staring at me. And, I'm desperately trying not to, cry or vomit or, whatever my natural response to that would have been. And I have a picture of me talking to President Obama, and most of my family, actually, when they heard about it, worried about the security of our country. But, so that was an amazing experience, something that most Cal foresters probably would never do. I spent 2 weeks at Camp David in July of 2000, helping the Clinton team get Prime Minister Barack and Chairman Arafat to come to an agreement. They didn't, but it was an amazing experience to watch all these Israelis and all these Palestinians, a bunch of senior Americans, and Secretary Albright, who Sandy mentioned was sort of in charge of our team, just driving a little electric truck with George Tenet sitting next to me, trying desperately to get the Palestinians and the Israelis to talk to each other. Probably the single most frightening experience of my career came after the Iraq War. And I don't know how many of you have read much of the history of that. The political divisions between the Republicans and the Democrats was pretty nasty. They took every opportunity to snipe at each other. And one of the great things about being at CIA is it's completely apolitical. There are Republicans, there are Democrats, there are agnostics, there are, you name it. We don't talk politics at work. We're about the mission and telling the truth. So I was asked to do an all-Senate briefing with Secretary Rumsfeld. So it's just Secretary Rumsfeld sitting there and me sitting here. And it was a room bigger than this with every single senator invited. 72 of them came. So all 72 senators get to ask you a question. And so it goes sort of like this. Senator Warner from Virginia would ask Secretary Rumsfeld a question. Mr. Rumsfeld, what do you think about the strength of the opposition in Iraq? And Secretary Rumsfeld would give an answer. The next senator, Senator Levin of Michigan, would ask, Mr. Liepman, what do you think of what Mr. Rumsfeld just said? And I was thinking, I think I'm going to need to go on unemployment pretty soon because I'm going to get fired. And I didn't. And, I had learned by that point in my career that you needed to sort of think pretty quickly on your feet. And I think that's what's next. You guys need to think of really hard questions for Charlie to answer and some relative softballs for me.
Thank you. I have a microphone in my hand, and if you have a question, will you raise your hand, and I will come to you, and I'm going to ask you to stand and state your name and your question. Now, we might have to work out, or maybe both of you want to try answers, or you might want to hand it to the other, whatever. Go ahead.
We could do this like Saturday Night Live, where we just...
Sure. Good afternoon. My name's Mary Perez. I'm from Mater Dei High School. My question is for both of you. And what's the typical protocol for how info is relayed from the intelligence agency to the State Department? And this question is in regards to the Benghazi incident.
That's a great question. So you're asking how intelligence or information is transferred from CIA to state or from state to CIA or either?
Either way, but particularly CIA.
Anybody?
So in this case, and I've spent a lot of time on the situation in Benghazi and what the cause of the attack on the consulate facility was and what we knew, and the way the information would flow is that CIA, not just CIA, but the intelligence community, establishes sort of a baseline of threat. And there's a lot of communication with each of the embassies, with the consulates. It's not just Benghazi, obviously. There are a ton of really dangerous places. Yemen is a really good example right now where in the last year of my career, I probably went to 30 meetings on the situation in Yemen and specifically the danger to the embassy from the terrorists in Sana'a. Same happens in Islamabad, in Peshawar, in Benghazi, Cairo, you name it. And the embassy is totally a part of that conversation. In fact, most of the information, a lot of the information that the intelligence community has about the local security situation actually comes from either Tripoli or Benghazi. So no one actually, in most cases, knows more about the local situation than the people who live there.
Yeah, I would just add, obviously, there's a diplomatic security bureau, which depends not only on the intelligence community, but its own regional security officers on the ground who report about conditions and threats. There's a free exchange of information flowing of an intelligence nature from CIA and the rest of the intelligence community. There's a vast intelligence community out there. It's the official budget of the National Intelligence Program released by the Director of National Intelligence is $52 billion. So the American public buys a lot of intelligence. But there's a lot of people involved in assessing threat levels at any given place in the world or any given post. And I worked with diplomatic security many times over the years.
I mean, the challenge in many cases is putting the pieces together. You have electronic information from intercepting communications. You have, imagery information from various platforms. You have open source information. Open source information is incredibly valuable, where you know what people are blogging, what they're tweeting, the challenge is, and in Benghazi, I think, we knew the situation in Libya was dangerous. I mean, everyone knows the situation in Benghazi is dangerous. What we didn't have is something specific that said these guys plan to attack the consulate on this day at this time. You know why we didn't have that? Because they probably didn't know they were going to attack. It wasn't a planned attack, it looks like.
But they didn't know, but you can always, given the atmosphere that Andy just described, you can issue alerts and warning alerts. I think the community and CIA, my own agency, needs to do a better job in this area and should do a better job.
When you mention $52 billion budget, is there kind of a division of focus in terms of that spending of that money? In other words, military and defense, the protection of America is, I guess, the most important. But how about all the other areas of information gathering, the protection of commerce and intellectual properties or that sort of thing? Is there a way to divide that?
I don't know you can divide it, but there is a National Intelligence Program, which is a publicly announced figure by Director Clapper, Director of National Intelligence. Then there's another budget, which I don't believe has been necessarily publicly stated. That's the Military Intelligence Programs, which is under the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Mike Vickers, former CIA officer who is now the Undersecretary for all, and he oversees from policy and budget the military programs, all intelligence programs. And yes, the civil agencies, the information that agriculture collects, the Food and Drug Administration, commerce. We get information flows from a variety of sources. All of that, as Andy said, it comes into part of answering those hard questions, that those threats, to be able to address those threats and anticipate those threats, to do this both strategic and tactical assessment and issue warnings where warnings are warranted.
And one of the biggest changes, interesting change that occurred after 9/11 was that we really didn't have domestic intelligence before 9/11. Britain and many of our Commonwealth partners had domestic intelligence organizations that conducted operations domestically. And we had the Federal Bureau of Investigation that does on a case-by-case basis, they investigate, but they had to evolve from a purely law enforcement organization to an intelligence organization, and somehow we had to figure out how to integrate them into this broader intelligence community. It was a challenge.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on that, and responding to your question, is that I was the Chief Intelligence Officer and Undersecretary at Homeland Security, working for Secretary Chertoff, and we worked, and there's an immense amount of law enforcement information, which from our perspective has a lot of intelligence value, collected by Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Citizens Immigration Services, agencies and elements that fall under DHS that you don't think about. The Drug Enforcement Administration provides an immense amount of intelligence for counter-narcotics, and some of that they also see counterterrorism. When I was the undersecretary, my job was not only to ensure that we work together as a department and with the rest of the intelligence community, making available law enforcement information, particularly to the National Counterterrorism Center, but to ensure that information flowed down to state and local governments. We have a federal system of government. We have a federal, state, and local. We had no ways of doing this. We had to work with the privacy, civil rights, civil liberties to make sure we did not ever abuse that information, because there's a lot of information domestically on U.S. persons. That Undersecretary Chertoff was a remarkable effort. We now have information sharing with the states, with cities, with what we call state fusion centers. It is a remarkable change over 10 years. And that's the reason the country has been kept safe, is through this kind of federal, state, and local collaboration, information sharing in ways that are unprecedented, while still very much worried about the privacy of U.S. citizens.
Thank you. Young lady in the rear.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Kat Fan from Fountain Valley High School. I would just like to ask that without 9/11 and such a devastating national security break in our nation, would the fracture of communication between the CIA and the FBI have been acknowledged, and what have you done to rectify that situation?
Well, the 9/11 Commission spelled this out very clearly, and the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act made certain that we would not repeat that mistake. There were errors made. You've got to remember that there were hearings in the 1970s. I know none of these people were alive, probably not even Andy. But we had Senator Church and Congressman Pike talked about abuses of CIA and other intelligence elements, such as the Army. So there was legislation drawn up. There was oversight. We have that focused us overseas, particularly the foreign intelligence community, really reinforced focusing overseas. Have we corrected everything? I don't know that I'll ever be satisfied, but we have the fracture between foreign and domestic, that there was a big red line there. That red line is very faint today. We really do work well, and Andy has a lot of experience in this area working with the Bureau.
And I think the answer actually is probably not, that without an event like 9/11, and we tend to respond to mistakes, to catastrophes, and then we learn a bunch of lessons and we put them in place, and then we have another one, and we have an event here tomorrow that sort of commemorates the '73 war, releases a bunch of information about it, and I'm going to talk about the intelligence failure that the '73 war was. No one predicted it, and we had tons of studies and investigations and reorganization and rethought after the '73 war, and that didn't fix everything because we kept making mistakes, largely because it's sort of human nature. We learn from our mistakes, but we're probably never going to perfect the system.
Gentleman in the middle here.
Hi,
If you actually stood up a little bit more, you could block that light.
Yeah.
do you want me to?
That would be, no, that's fine.
That's okay.
Actually, if you stood on your chair, no, don't do that.
Hi, I'm Zach Porter of Esperanza High School, and what forms of interrogation is being used instead of the now outlawed use of waterboarding, and how do you feel on the subject?
I don't really talk a lot about enhanced interrogation techniques. I do know, however, that today we have policies in effect on that, as you know, the military follows the Army interrogation manual, which is quite there. There is a very careful, I'll let Andy get into this if he wants to, but from my perspective, in 2001, I was there We had pressures beyond belief from the American public, from the American press, from the American Congress, from the administration to find out if there was going to be another 9/11. And our objective was to, if necessary, make sure there was no major attack coming, because there were many reports through many means saying there would be another attack. The agency did what it had to do under careful guidance from the Attorney General's office, and all the legal work was done there. All this is out in public. It was briefed fully to the Congress, in my view, and it is a past chapter in American history. In my view, that the Central Intelligence Agency acted honorably in what was required by a finding of the President of the United States, which was validated by the Attorney General, in which the Congress was fully briefed.
Gentleman here in the middle.
Good, I didn't have to say anything. Let me just say, I think hindsight is a terrific thing, and it's always easier to say I would have done this differently, or we should have thought more about this policy. And I think in hindsight, with the benefit of knowing what's happened since, we could have done some things better.
We could have, but at the time, right. I think we did what we thought was appropriate, and we did it very appropriately under legal findings from both the executive and we informed the legislative branch of what we were doing.
That's right. I think certainly it was legal, and you can have endless discussions and debates over whether it was either ethical or honorable or whatever. But at the time, in 2001, 2002, the government, the intelligence community, was completely convinced that there were other waves of attacks. And so I think Charlie's right. Maybe.
Yeah, my oldest daughter, she has a doctorate in psychology and teaches a lot, and she came to tell me after some of the memorandums, the unredacted memorandums were released by the current administration, she said, "That was torture, Dad." I said, "Chris, you weren't there. I was there, and I was working 7 days a week. I worked every day from September the 11th to 22 March. I drove to work in the dark and went home in dark. The holidays meant nothing because we were trying to keep the country safe." And I'm very proud of my record. I'm very proud of what Andy has done. I'm very proud of what the Central Intelligence Agency has done. We have not had a successful attack inbound into the United States since September the 11th.
That is actually something I think we tend to forget, that the efforts of a lot of folks have kept the country safe, amazingly safe. If on September 12th, 2001, we had gotten together in this room, and someone would have suggested that fewer than a dozen people were going to be killed in the United States in the next decade as a result of terrorism, they would have been laughed out of the room. I actually heard an interesting statistic the other day, and that is that more people have been killed by lightning this year than were killed by terrorism in the United States in the last decade. That's not an accident. It's not because people don't want to kill us. It's because we have a bunch of folks who are working really hard. And I don't get me wrong, I don't credit the interrogation techniques. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons. It's the fullness of the effort by the Department of Homeland Security, CIA, the Defense Department. I mean, you guys, we're sitting here relatively safe from attack today, which is not the way it was 12 years ago.
And let me tell you, the work that we did was very strenuous. Secretary Chertoff is a very demanding, I worked for him, and he wanted facts and data, and he wanted it all the time. He could not get enough to make sure that no door was open for an attack here in the homeland, or attack from within, from homegrown terrorists. I still work for Secretary Chertoff in private industry, So it's people like the secretary that really inspires me, and I'm very proud of my service, incredibly proud of what Andy has done in the National Counterterrorism Center.
Hello, good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Mason Lyle, and I'm from Corona Del Mar High School. Both of you spoke towards the value of integrating the intelligence community among itself, and both of you have contributed effort to that integration of information. What kind of software infrastructure is necessary to that sort of information sharing, and what kind of network security is there in place to ensure the safety of shared information?
Well, I think that's a great question. It's a terrific question.
You have a job waiting for you at the
Yeah, we need you now. Look, and this is public information. The intelligence community is going to do cloud computing. The 5 larger agencies plus the FBI are building what we call a community cloud, which involves NSA leading the way with the National Geospatial Agency, the National Reconnaissance Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, plus the FBI. CIA is building a private cloud that will interface with the community cloud. There are great issues here. That issue is one that, in my consulting capacity, currently with some of our clients, and I also consult back with the Director of National Intelligence. Those are big questions. How to secure in the cloud all the data, and how to ensure that supply chain is there too, and how to ensure that the software there's not some glitch somewhere in the software that would put someone inside these very closed networks of highly sensitive information. I'll let Andy talk about it, but to me, these are big challenges, and we need people like you.
Two fundamental challenges that my organization had to tackle when we were created after 9/11. One was, how do you share information and yet keep it safe? How do you ensure that when CIA and FBI and NSA and all the other 3-letter organizations send NCTC its most sensitive data, how can they be sure that it's not going to escape and that some foreign agency is going to come in and get it? And it's a big challenge. And one of the results of that is that if you have a choice between sharing something and having a small risk that it will be compromised, or not sharing it and have no risk, the general approach has been don't share it, because we don't want any risk. So we've been working really hard. It's not entirely a software thing. You know, the biggest vulnerability, the number one vulnerability in our system is not electronics or electrons, it's human beings. And so, you know, that's sort of our principal challenge.
Andy is so right there. Counterintelligence is a discipline that is very much a discipline, and it's one with which Mr. Hutchinson here has a great familiarity, a former CIA officer. That is still the greatest weakness, and we know that efforts have been made and continue to be made to penetrate into the U.S. intelligence agencies.
The other question, the other balance, and I do this really quickly, I'm surprised no one's asked, some of you are probably thinking about it. Lots of times when I speak to student groups, they ask me if I'm reading their email. And I usually ask if there's anything interesting in it, and if so, they could just CC me. But the answer, I mean, that goes to the second challenge, and that is the balance between protecting civil liberties and protecting the country. And there's a big overlap between those two things, because you can't protect the country and ignore civil liberties. I'm from Berkeley. My mother lives in San Francisco. It's a pretty freewheeling liberal environment out there that is pretty suspicious of my organization. But so we have to make absolutely sure that not only are we doing a good job, that we build the trust of the general public, that they don't think that we're surveilling them, that they're reading grandma's emails. And the truth of the matter is, even if I was interested in reading your grandmother's email, and I don't know your grandmother, but I suspect isn't that interesting, we don't have time to do that. You know, we are focused on bad people. We're focused on people we know have a track record of threatening the country. So unless your grandmother's threatening the country, she shouldn't have a whole lot to worry about.
Well spoken.
The gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm James Thies from Edison High School. Since the attack on Benghazi, what extra precautions has the CIA taken to prevent another similar situation from happening in embassies in Yemen and Islamabad and Cairo?
Well, the Central Intelligence Agency, along with the rest of the community, have constantly looked for threats to the diplomatic facilities and certainly to prominent Americans abroad, our diplomatic staffs. And those assessments are made on a continuing basis. A lot of this information, of course, has to flow to, for example, for for American embassies and all posts to the Department of State. And in the Department of State, there is an Undersecretary for Management, Undersecretary Kennedy, and under him, there is the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, which has to also do assessments. We can alert and we can warn. We take measures on our own, the Central Intelligence Agency, to protect its personnel abroad. I won't go further than that, but we protect our people, but we have this overwhelming responsibility to help protect American interests and American personnel, including official personnel who are posted at our embassies and our consulates globally.
Did any of you watch any of Secretary Clinton's marathon session with Congress? Pretty interesting. She's a pretty impressive person. I mean, I've been in meetings with her, and she usually cuts to the absolute core issue. And you know, they kept pressing her, and basically, I think that in order to do the job of diplomacy, we have to take risk. You can't operate in a foreign environment with complete safety. So you have to know that. Foreign Service officers, CIA officers who operate in Islamabad, in Yemen, in Cairo, in Brussels, they understand that there's some element of threat. Our job is not to eliminate it. Our job is to make sure that we illuminate the threat as well as possible so people understand it. The limitations in budget, I mean, you should see some of the embassies that our people work out of. It is shameful. The first time I went to the embassy in Damascus, and it's now closed, but the first time I went was in the 80s, and it was a police state, it was relatively safe. It was, you know, you had apartment buildings overlooking the embassy that shared walls with compounds in, you know, very densely packed downtown Damascus. Well, we had a choice. We could either move out of the embassy and not do the job that we had to do, or we had to, you know, take as many precautions as we could. You also, you know, after Benghazi, there were all these debates over were there enough Marines and why weren't more people there. Well, we don't have enough Marines to make every facility in the world safe. We just don't. We have to rely to some extent on the local police, and in this case, we relied on the wrong guys, and they were unreliable. And you know, Secretary Clinton, 4 people lost their jobs. 4 pretty senior people in the Department of State were fired after that. It's pretty unusual in the federal government for that to happen. And that's going to send a very powerful signal, I think, to the department, to other people, that we need to do a better job of managing risk, not eliminating it.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that on resources, that's a big issue. You got to realize there's been an effort to cut, and the reductions in the state's operating budgets goes back to the 1990s. There were sharp cuts. Its operating budget was cut about a third. I remember going with Pat Kennedy, who's now the Undersecretary for Management when he was Assistant Secretary for Administration, going to various committee and committee chairs pleading for more money for the Department of State, not for CIA, for the Department of State, so they could better carry out and execute its missions abroad.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name's Gavin Rose from Esperanza High School. And one of the biggest criticisms of these independent executive agencies like the CIA is that they're given a lot of leeway and aren't necessarily in the sphere of influence from the branches of government. So although briefings take place, what do the Congress and the President really know about the CIA, their intelligence, and the nature of how their missions are executed?
I know Andy will have some things to say on that one. As we're not, you would be very much surprised. We have two oversight committees. One was formed in 1976 and one in 1978. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. We give hundreds and hundreds of briefings to those committees. The Central Intelligence Agency does every year. On virtually any subject, they can request those briefings, and they're given in detail. They go over every element within our budget, no matter how sensitive. Those are looked at and reviewed. They're first reviewed by the Office of Management and Budget. The information that flows to, as Andy said earlier, we're apolitical. Our job is to help keep the country safe. We work very hard at doing that. We're not there to circumvent the President of the United States, the National Security Staff, the National Security Council, or the Congress. And we have select committees that look at every line item in our budget. And if they see things that are not that do not seem appropriate, we're called in. We have very fine audits of all our budgets and all of our activities. We're very much, and the question is, you want a Central Intelligence Agency. A Central Intelligence Agency goes where other people don't go, and the Central Intelligence Agency is sometimes directed by the President to do things that other agencies can't do. You want to make sure you have a mission-oriented organization. I think CIA is that. We do not hold information back from the President, his National Security Council, or the Congress of the United States.
Yeah, that's true. I spent, in my last job, I would say 4 days a week, I had meetings in the White House. Not with President Obama, but that happened once every 2 weeks. He's a pretty penetrating guy, and he would ask pretty tough questions. What are you doing? And you know, he would really expect the details. But his staff, Dennis McDonough and John Brennan, who's now been nominated to be the director of Central Intelligence Agency, they know. We just didn't keep secrets from them. The question of oversight from Congress. Now, there's lots of debate. Did they tell me this? Did they not? I think my general impression is that we leaned very far forward to make sure that our oversight committees knew what we were doing. And whether it was at the member level, the senators and the congressmen or their staffs, I spent a lot of time doing Iraq back in right after the war. So from 2003 to 2005, I did Iraq. And I spent probably 6 hours a week in meetings down on the Hill, making sure that the staffs, and I can tell you there were staffers from both sides of the aisle that I really wanted to beat up. And I was totally apolitical. Republicans, Democrats, I hated them all because they were trying to get information from me to beat up each other. It was all political on theirs. Much of it was political. One last example on access. Dianne Feinstein, senator from the fabulous state of California, just released a study that her staff did. She didn't release the study because it's very sensitive, but it's about the interrogation techniques. So her staff did a study over the past year and a half that looked at the question, not was it right, was it legal, because that's not their job. That was determined to be, that was the Justice Department job. Their job was to determine whether they thought the information that came out of it led to the
was of real value.
Was of value.
Was of real value.
And that staff came out. Their answer was no. But in the process of that study, they actually examined 6 million pages of documents that CIA made available to them. Essentially, CIA will bring the staffers in and say, "Here's our computer. Here's every password you need." They have exactly the same access that Charlie or I would have in the building. So it's at this point in our history, this is no longer Cuba and the Bay of Pigs. In this point in our history, I would say it's virtually impossible for CIA to hide something of any magnitude from Congress or the President.
I can assure you it really is impossible. All the projects are approved. We do some amazing things. We do some amazing things technically that seems to defy the law of physics at times in accomplishing getting inside our enemies and our enemies' secrets. I'm really very proud of what we do. And I'm very proud that we are, as an organization, I saw our organization, it was a closed organization, more closed than today, where the Congress really didn't want to be informed. I went down, I remember as a young officer, with older people to brief on a particular project, and this senator said, well, I don't know anymore. Well, today we have aggressive staffs on the Hill, and they ask hard questions, and we respond honestly on what we know.
And it's, sometimes it's enjoyable, sometimes it's not, but I think the process of oversight, the process of communication is good. Before Sandy closes this, I did want to say, 30-some years ago when I left California, I had no idea I was going to go to CIA. I mean, I look back at the 30-some years I spent there, and it was a pretty fortunate accident for me. I mean, it's an amazing adventure. I didn't have to hang my ethics up when I came into the building in the morning and pick them up on the way out. I never had to compromise my values, my integrity. And I was born and raised in Berkeley, and my mother asked me way harder questions than either you or the staffers ever did. So it is if you like to travel and you're into sort of figuring out puzzles, it's a fascinating and pretty enjoyable. 30 years went by really fast.
47 years went by just as fast. Very compressed.
When I started the agency, I think, Charlie, I had a lot of hair. That's the one complaint.
Once upon a
one
time.
complaint I would have. I don't know what the hell happened to my hair.
Mine has grown back.
Please join me in thanking these great patriots for sharing an afternoon. Thank you. And thank you for all that you do and your colleagues do to keep our country safe. You radiate pride in your work and your careers and your accomplishments, and I share it with you, and thank you for sharing it with these young people. I've been bothered, though, by seeing these paper coffee cups up here, and I know you spend late nights figuring things out, so I wanted to present to you as a modest token of thanks.
Thank you very much.
Very expensive, one-of-a-kind,
Famous signature there.
custom-made mugs that have the logo of the Richard Nixon Centennial, and that is this year, our 100th. There are no microphones hidden in there. There's no detecting things, but now I promised you, or we promised you, we'd get you home so your parents don't call about homework and missing dinner, so we're going to wrap it up. However, we did say that if any of you, any of the photographers in the group would like to get your group photographed with Andy and Charlie, why now's the time to do it.
We will not be offended if you say no.
And remember to send us, and it's in your press kit, our web address or our email address. Send us your stories. Send us your photographs. We'd love to publish them. Thank you to the faculty advisors for making this possible for you to come, and thanks to all of you for coming. We'll let you know about the next one. We hope to see you then. Thank you.